Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new edition of Euroquestions, the bi-monthly webinar of the Jacques Delors Institute. Today, we have the pleasure to welcome Jannik Jansen, policy fellow at the Jacques Delors Centre in Berlin. The notion of a board-green backlash is set to dominate the European election campaign. Based on the new survey data from more than 2,000 respondents in Germany, France, and Poland, a study of the Jacques Delors Centre in Berlin shows that there is a largely overblown. A majority of voters still wish for more ambitious climate policy and would support a raft of concrete measures to bring down emissions. So what difference exists in attitude toward the green transition among the three countries? How do political ideologies within each country shape perspective on climate action? And what are the implications of the upcoming election campaign? I would like to remind you that there is the Q&A tool available at the bottom of your screen where you can ask the question. So Jannik, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for having me. Okay, let's start. I think we can directly go into the presentation. I think right now, if we are talking to EU experts in Brussels, Berlin, or Paris, everybody will mention that climate will be one of the defining topics of the upcoming election campaigns. This as such is not completely new. So if we have looked back to the last European elections in 2019, we have also seen protests that related to climate. Only back then, it was primarily young people taking to the streets to demonstrate in favor of more ambitious climate policy. This time now, 5 years later on, the tone has shifted. So we see not any longer younger people taking to the street, but rather farmers rolling into the EU capitals with their tractors to vent their anger about EU regulations in the climate area. So policymakers responded to this. We have seen an impact of these demonstrations as far-right parties have been very quick in trying to capitalize on these protests, but we also seen that liberal and conservative politicians have become way more hesitant to endorse European deal climate initiatives in the parliament, as they perceive that there is a broader shift among the public when it comes to the ambition in climate policy. So what we wanted to check with our study was whether this green backlash or this notion of a green backlash is actually reflected in what people say on the ground. If you can skip one slide further, then I can show you what we have done. So how did we approach this question? In a joint study with Tarek Abouchadi from the University of Oxford and Markus Kohlberg from the Humboldt University here in Berlin, we conducted a survey with around 15,000 participants, 5,000 participants in 3 countries, namely Poland, Germany, and France. The important thing here is that this amount of data actually allows us to not only look at average climate policy preferences in these countries, but also to look into the preferences of different subgroups in the countries. Also, the data is relatively new. We conducted the survey at the end of last year, so it gives us a timely snapshot of what people actually think in the climate policy area. So I will only present the key findings here, but if you have more time, you can also delve into our interactive dashboard online. But let's start with what we have found. So when we look at general support for climate policy, and I think you can already skip to the next slide here, we asked participants whether they would be willing on a scale from 0 to 10, where 10 relates to climate policy already went too far, or 0, which means that climate policy should go even further. That participants actually in all 3 countries are still in favor of a more ambitious climate policy. Here on the graph, you can see the results for France, and there you can see that 57% of our sample actually said that they still wish for more ambitious climate policy. This said, it should not be overlooked that there is a sizable minority which has grown skeptical towards climate ambition. In France, this is about 23%. In Germany and Poland, it's around 30% of our sample. Important here to mention is that this group is very dominated by supporters of far-right parties. So we don't really see that the political center of the spectrum really has grown skeptical towards climate ambition, but it's rather the extreme right. Also, if we compare our results to other surveys which have been conducted in previous years and ask a very similar question, we don't see a large increase of this minority group of climate skeptics. That was the general question. Politically, it is important whether this abstract support for climate policy then actually also translate into support for concrete policies. So if we go to the next slide here, what we have done is then we asked the participants about their attitudes towards 40 different policies. And no worries, I'm not going through all of the 40 policies here at this slide. What I want to do is just give you a big picture of the results. By asking them about their preferences for these 40 different policies, on average, we can then see which policies are more popular or less popular. And we can also see which types of policy, for example, bans, standards, or green subsidies are more popular than others. If you look at the graph, then you can see that the dashed line there, the horizontal and vertical ones, indicate the status quo. So no additional policies that would be implemented. So this gives you a broad picture that all of the dots, which are in the upper right quadrant, indicate policies that would be preferred to the status quo of not implementing any additional measures. All dots which are in the left bottom of the graph, these represent policies which would be less popular than sticking to the status quo. So what we can see here in France is that there's a broad spectrum of policies which would be actually still preferred towards freezing climate legislation. If we compare that to Germany, for example, which is now the next slide, we see that this range of policies which are popular is less broad, but there's still a lot of political legroom, a lot of policies which voters would prefer to sticking to the status quo. This is the same more or less for Poland as well. And on the next slide, then we can explain some of the main findings with regard to different instruments. So what we can see is, and that's what I just explained, that there still is a wide range of climate policies which are still preferred towards the status quo. So we don't see a real indicator of this green backlash. But when it comes to specific types of policies, we also see some patterns. So what we see is that most of these preferred policies, there are a lot of policies which tend to be costly, but which are mainly in the area of green investments or green industrial policies to green the economy. Also, we find support for targeted regulatory measures, such as standards for the industry or for power generation. On the other side, we see that broader bans or CO2 pricing mechanisms, especially in the area of transportation or housing, are less popular. This might be related to the fact that these areas might impose direct costs on the households themselves in the form of higher prices, or that these households would have to undergo costly adjustment processes to switch to climate-friendly alternatives. Then if we continue here with the next slide, what we have seen is that what we have not seen is that material factors such as income or the sector where people work, they don't seem to systematically influence climate preferences. But what we have seen on the other side is that partisanship plays a huge role there. So if we look here at the graph, which illustrates the preferences among voters of green and left-leaning parties in Germany, we see that these voters would actually support almost all climate policies towards the status quo. So for them, it doesn't really matter as long as something is done. If we then look at the other end of the political spectrum, which is now on the next slide, we see that the contrary is true for those that vote for the AfD. These voters would oppose basically all climate policies except from broad investments into green infrastructure, such as the railroad system or the grid, electricity grid. Then rather, if we now look, the group for which it really matters, which policies are implemented, is the political center. So voters of liberal and conservative parties. And if we go one slide further, we can see a picture which is more similar to the average that we have seen earlier on. Those voters really prefer industrial policies, green investment policies, but are more opposed to CO2 pricing mechanisms or broader bans. We can now continue to the next slide. That were the results for Germany, but if we also look at the other countries, this pattern or this ideological cleavage holds more or less true. However, we've seen that in France, if we actually look here into the left column of the graph, we see that even far-right voters in France, so voters of Rassemblement National, would actually support a wider range of climate policies. And this might be actually related to the broader electoral outreach of his party compared to the AfD in Germany, for example. But what we see is that the pattern in general is true. Now we can continue to the next slide, because what we have seen is basically a political dilemma. Policymakers now have to implement, if they follow at least like the preferences of voters, policies which tend to be more costly. So they need to find ways how to finance those policies. And on the other hand, policies which might be necessary from a climate perspective, such as CO2 pricing, are more opposed or negatively perceived by voters. That's why we looked also into the design of concrete policies. So how would policies need to be designed to actually gather societal approval for these measures? When we look at industrial policies, that we can clearly see that raising the financial resources for these policies via general tax increases would be rather unpopular. On the other hand, getting or sourcing this money via budget cuts or let's say a reprioritization among policy areas or higher public debt would be more favored by voters. If we look then at the unpopular policies, we can clearly see that the popularity of or the acceptance of introducing CO2 pricing mechanism would be way higher if these ones are accompanied by some form of compensation to households. And there we can see a clear preference for a progressive form of compensation. So all households should receive some money, but those households that are hit hardest, especially low and middle income households, they should receive higher amounts of money. And also we have some indications for policymaking at the EU level. So what we see is right now at the EU level that our policy mix is that rather defined by regulatory measures, as we don't have a permanent investment instrument, or we won't have one after the next generation runs out in a couple of years. So we wanted to see whether voters would actually support such an instrument at the EU level. And actually, more or less surprisingly, what we find is that voters across all party lines would be actually in favor of such an instrument, but it would be important for policymakers to also highlight that this instrument would also support other policy priorities, above all economic security and convergence. So what do we take from all of this? And then we can go to the next slide to the final takeaways for the European election campaigns. So first of all, I think it's clear to say that we haven't found in our data that this notion of a green backlash is true for the broad public in these three countries. Actually, the opposite is true. We have seen that majorities in all three countries would wish for more ambitious climate policy. When we look at the design, then this is also important for voters, though, especially for voters which are kind of in the middle of the of the political spectrum. So for these kind of, let's say, swing voters, whose preferences towards climate policy might be more adjustable, it actually matters which policies are implemented and how they are designed. We have also seen that policy preferences are strongly linked to partisanship. So it actually will make a difference how parties run their campaigns. If they are just trying to outbid each other about who will scale down most in terms of climate ambition, they actually might contribute to creating the climate fatigue, which they are, or the perceived climate fatigue they are actually trying to cater to. So what should policymakers do instead, especially when we look towards the upcoming legislative term at the European stage? I think two main takeaways are important here. We have seen that green industrial and investment policies would be preferred by most voters, and this is true in all three countries. So it will actually be one of the defining questions, okay, how will these policies actually be financed at the EU level? And then if we are looking also at the regulatory measures, there it will be important that we at the European level, or that policymakers at the European level find a way to realize a just transition in a better way, and especially their focus on progressive compensation will be important, especially when the emission trading system at the European level will be extended to sectors which are closer to the purse of households. Yeah, I think these are the main takeaways, and then we can continue now with the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jannik, for your presentation. Maybe a first question that I would like to ask is, who is to blame for this bad narrative on green policy that are extremely unpopular?
So if we are thinking about whom to blame, I mean, we see that like some people are actually facing difficulties already in adjusting towards the transition. And I think we shouldn't dismiss the protest there too early on. I mean, there are definitely, for example, farmers which will face problems in adjusting to the green transition. And I think it's important that policymakers ensure these voters and enterprises that they will be supported in the process of adjusting. On the other hand, I think it is clear to say that especially far-right parties have been very effective in actually capitalizing on this narrative and framing transition policies as especially burdensome and unfair. And I think here it is really important that conservative parties and liberal parties will not just simply take on this narrative, but rather cater really to and debate how the policy mix in the future should be designed.
Thank you. Maybe a second question. So why are the Green parties losing ground in the poll for the during this European campaign? The Green group is set to lose many MEPs in the upcoming election.
Could you repeat? I didn't get like the full question there.
Sorry. So the question is, why is the Green Party losing ground in the poll for the European election? The Green group is set to lose many MEPs in the upcoming election.
I mean, I think there are a couple of factors which play a role. Of course, we have seen huge protests in favor of climate policy in the run-up to the last election. So Greens were actually riding a little bit or profiting from these protests in favor of more ambitious climate policies back then, which doesn't mean that people are less concerned about the effects of climate change nowadays. So actually, when we look, which we also did, we asked people in France, Germany, and Poland whether they still are afraid of the consequences of not doing anything and of the negative impact of climate change. And there we see, for example, that 80% of the electorate in France is actually expecting to be feeling these negative consequences of climate change within the next 10 years. In Poland and Germany is 60%. So we still see that people are concerned about it, and that green parties there still have a topic. But then there are, of course, different factors which also contributed to the surge of far-right parties. And I don't think all of those are really related to climate issues here. This is definitely a broader spectrum of topics which plays a role here. But yeah, I mean, they have been effective in also using this narrative of a green backlash, as it kind of fits their other narratives of the elite, which is imposing measures on the people.
Thank you. Another question coming back of what you were saying about the farmer protests, and in France and all across Europe, we've seen a rise of protests from the farmers. What lesson can we take from this movement when the media often frames it as anti-climate fight?
It's a what fight? It's a
anti-climate and environmental fight.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I think is necessary to acknowledge, like I said beforehand, that a lot of farmers actually face problems right now. Not all of them are related to environmental regulations. I think that's also important to say. Just slashing all environmental standards, which we have established in the last term, will not solve all of these problems. I mean, they are also facing a very competitive economic context right now. And I think these problems really have to be addressed, and that will be go beyond environmental rules here. But I'm also saying it should be, of course, checked whether some of these rules are imposing too much red tape on farmers, and their policymakers have to make adjustments. But that doesn't mean that there should be a rollback of all or a blind rollback of all environmental regulations, as it is kind of clear that also this sector will have to adjust, and not doing it now would be more costly in the long run.
Thank you. Another question is, how is involving the civil society and citizens of the EU the solution to make climate policy with wider support across parties?
The role of the civil society in this process? So I think it will be important that the next commission or the next set of policymakers pays a stronger emphasis on designing just transition processes in a more comprehensive way than it is done so far. So going beyond the add-ons that we have now to our European Green Deal in the form of the Social Climate Fund or the Just Transition Mechanism, there we see that I think it will be very important to also include stakeholders, social partners in the way of finding and designing individual solutions for regions, enterprises, and sectors to move forward, and then to reassure also these different players and sectors that the costs of the transition will be actually fairly distributed.
Thank you. Actually, another question would be, one of the concerns that we hear from citizens about climate is how to adapt the employment to climate transition. Does the European Union have the resources to match its ambition, for example, for the Green Deal, with the green jobs?
So what to be done? I mean, I think what's clear is that to implement industrial policies or green investments, which might actually help, like transition economic sectors moving forward and industries, we will actually have to ask or face the question of financing these transitions, or at least unlocking private investments, which are necessary via public investments. And I think their green investments should go beyond actually beyond mere financial support, but it will also be important to transition workers and support workers especially from former, for example, coal sectors, fossil fuel sectors, in adapting to this transition. So what we see is that we will need a lot of workers in these green sectors and clean tech sectors, which Europe aims to cater or to locate within Europe. And there, I think it's also important to invest not only in the production of and deployment of these technologies, but also in the skills development.
Thank you. Another question that is raised is what are the biggest differences between France and Germany in terms of preferred policies?
So I think when we look at the data, I think it was fairly surprising that the France electorate is very in favor of implementing additional climate policies. So like we've seen in the graphs beforehand, there is a broader range of concrete policies which are supported. And this is a clear difference to Poland and Germany, where we see that there's also a wide range, but it's definitely smaller than in France. What we think this might be related to is the large level of concern of the negative effects of climate change in France. As we are looking, for example, at the droughts and the heat waves of the last years in France, I think people are very aware of the negative consequences of not implementing and additional measures and not continuing the path towards transitioning. So I think that's a clear difference there, that people in France or in regions of France might be actually more aware of the consequences already and therefore support a broader range of policies.
Thank you. And maybe one last question. So in your study, did you come across other data from other EU countries, particularly in the southern of Europe?
So, I mean, what we have done is only looking at the 3 countries we just described. We decided to do so because we needed a critical mass of participants to actually be able to look into the differences between different subgroups. Of course, it would be interesting also to look at other countries, like you mentioned, in the Central or European or Eastern European region, especially because they will also face different challenges in transitioning. For example, if we look at households there, a lot of households already facing energy poverty right now. So adjusting actually there in the housing sector will be a different challenge than it will be in other countries. And I think it would be interesting also to look into theirs. There are a lot of surveys actually looking already into preferences among voters in these countries, but we haven't done so.
Thank you very much, Jannik, for your presentation, and thank you to everyone for following today's Euroquestion. We will send the replay over to you this afternoon. Our next session will be held on Wednesday, 10th of April. We will have the pleasure to welcome Philippe Pochet. He's a counselor at the Jacques Delors Institute, and he will present the challenges of the next EU Social Summit mid-April. This webinar will be in French. So thank you again, Jannik, for your presentation, and see you in 3 weeks.
Thank you so much for having me.